Fabian-Nunez, the Speaker of the Assembly, also talked a little bit about the process in Sacramento and what's going on now. And comments that drew attention certainly from those of us in the press corps, but I think a lot of the people in attendance. And by the way, there were, I would guess, at least a couple of hundred people at this thing. It was a very well-attended luncheon talking about legislative reforms and seeing all these icons of California politics sitting up there on the stage. But Speaker Nunez talked about the expectations game of whether the legislature, the expectations of the legislature are too high. And keep in mind here that Speaker Nunez is a strong supporter and really the leading proponent of Proposition 93, which is on the ballot in February, which would modify the state's term limits law, would reduce time in office from an ability of having 14 years in office down to 12, but would allow all 12 years to be served in one chamber, and, as we now know, and the No on 93 campaign is highlighting, would allow folks like Nunez and a few others to stay in office longer than the current term limits law. But listen to Speaker Nunez talking about what he perceives as the problems in the public, and not just the public, but those of us in the press, and the expectations game about state politics.
We're being judged by the press based upon whether or not we're going to hit another home run this year like we did last year, as opposed to, are we making a difference? Are we making some progress? And I think that this blockbuster fatigue that people are experiencing now is something folks got to get over. It's not realistic. It's good when you want to push the legislature around, but at the end of the day, if you believe in our form of government, being that it's a democratic form of government, people are elected democratically in their districts, and if you have any faith in California and the values that we cherish as a state, I think that people need to really take a step back and view this from the perspective that it is not the perception that people will write about to try and drive a wedge between good government and tough government, and really take a step back and give this institution a bit of a break, because I think people are coming at us with a hammer these days, and let me just finish by this, especially the print media, and I don't mean this as a direct criticism, but we know,
kind of oblique, as opposed to,
but we know it's been losing market share. I mean, if you look, we know it's been losing a lot of market share. So what needs to happen in order to sell newspaper is you gotta tighten those screws.
That was Speaker Fabian-Nunez, and again, taking a shot, I think, at the press corps, in particular, those in the newspaper business. My take on that is I think that the Speaker is protesting probably in the wrong direction somewhat, because, and again, it's difficult to know, and I didn't follow up with him, full disclosure on this, but, clearly he starts to talk about editorial boards, which is, if you read newspapers, the editorial pages are different than those of us in the straight news business. But, the Speaker is being watched closely. But the reality is that expectations are not only set high, I would argue, by the press, but also by lawmakers. And they love to tout things when they succeed, but they're not so happy to talk about them when they fail. Finally, here at this event on Tuesday, something light to end on, since all these big subjects. Of course, as you can tell, the whole event had a lot of laughter and a lot of jokes in it, but the ultimate in jokes. And, well, this is Willie-Brown being Willie-Brown. But each member was asked, each lawmaker or former lawmaker was asked, what are they most proud of in their time in office and what was their greatest disappointment? Jim-Brulte, former Republican leader, was talking about the law that he wrote and helped pass that he was most proud of, and, well, you'll see where it goes from there with the ever-quotable Willie-Brown.
I wrote a law that allowed young girls, actually anyone that had a child, to surrender it at hospitals or fire stations within the first 72 hours after birth. Scores of little kids have been saved as a result of that. I think that's my proudest moment. My biggest disappointment was in a Big Five meeting once, Ken Maddie, David Roberti, Willie-Brown, and Pete. And I looked around the room and pointed out that they were all old enough to be my father. And Willie was the only one that claimed parentage.
Great. Governor Wilson? Governor Wilson.
In that group, probably the only one capable of it. As we have always said of Willie, all that and modesty too.
And I think former Governor Pete Wilson there at the end speaking, I think tried to find a polite but still funny way to get out of that. But there was a lot of levity on the stage. And I think one of the things as an observer watching this event is you saw a level of camaraderie there between Democrats and Republicans of a former era that doesn't exist at the state capitol these days. The reasons are numerous. There are many things that have changed, some things for the worse, some things for the better, clearly, than the way that the legislative process used to work. But the camaraderie is nowhere near as strong today as it was those days. Maybe the stakes are higher. Again, maybe society is different. So it was interesting to watch, and for political junkies, boy, this was just a custom-made event for those who are big followers of California politics. That'll do it for this week's edition of the podcast. We'll be back next week, probably with a journalist roundtable. For myself, I guess it's just for me. I'm John Myers from KQED and the California Report. We'll see you next time.